All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to February's second Thursday lecture, brought to you by the Friends of the Cabildo and the Louisiana State Museum, and featuring this month, author Katy Shannon. I'm Chris Cook, the Director of Education at the Louisiana State Museum, and before we begin, I have a few announcements. First, everyone please stay muted during the lecture. If you are unmuted, we can help mute you. But I don't want to discourage any questions. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat as those questions come to you. When it's time to kick off the Q&A, because we will have time for a question and answer session at the end of this, I will kick off the Q&A by reading the questions that came into the chat first. Usually in the order they came in. Sometimes I'll group them together, but please, and I'm going to put out another reminder before we get going. If you have questions, type them into the chat. I'll read those out first. Also a reminder that all registrants will receive a recording of this presentation tomorrow. And if you have any friends or know of anybody who is interested, but they didn't register in time, have them reach out to me, and I can get the recording to them. And with that, I would like to turn it over to our author, our presenter. Katy Shannon is the author of Antoine of Oak Alley, The Unlikely Origin of Southern Pecans, and the Enslaved Gardener Who Cultivated Them, which won the 2022 Phyllis Wheatley Book Award for Best Biography. She was instrumental in the early stages of research for Whitney Plantation, created a searchable online database of more than 400 enslaved individuals at Evergreen Plantation, and co-curated an exhibit about the enslaved community at Laura Plantation. Her forthcoming book, which we found out she just received a copy of today, is coming out next month and is the subject of tonight's lecture. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to tonight's speaker.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so grateful for this opportunity, and thank you for everyone who is joining in tonight. Now, I'm gonna find my PowerPoint presentation. Okay. And here we go. So, my book is entitled Invisible Blackness, A Louisiana Family in the Age of Racial Passing. Now, this age of racial passing was considered at its height between the years of 1880 and 1925. And I often say identify as white because passing can be a charged, a very charged kind of language. But this is what the scholarship has called it and what it's been known as for forever, really. And of course, here in Creole New Orleans, it was called passe blanc, passing for white. So the rate of passing corresponded with the severity of oppression and discrimination toward Blacks in the South. So the worse that the discrimination and the violence became, the higher the rate of passing became. It's estimated that 110,000 people chose to begin to identify as white at a rate of between 2,500 and 2,750 people per year. However, in Louisiana, that number may have been far greater and may have contributed to the total nationally in ways we cannot really quantify. We likely will never know how high a figure people in Louisiana choosing to identify as white during this time period was. And there are plenty of factors for that. And I'm going to get into some of those in terms of New Orleans exceptionalism later on. Now, this all began as something very personal for me. I am a 10th generation Louisiana native. My family has been here since 1718. So my maternal grandmother, her mother was a Douay from St. John Parish. So on one side of the screen, you're going to see my granny. She was my great grandmother, Bertha Douay, bourgeois, and I knew her until I was 15 when she died. And the thing about Granny is that she and the gentleman on the other side of the on the slide, his name is Albert. They shared a common ancestor named Jacques Douay. He was an overseer on a plantation in St. John the Baptist Parish, and he had a relationship with an enslaved woman that resulted in children whom he it was long term and he acknowledged, but then he also had his white family and they all lived in within the same neighborhood. So Granny's great grandfather and this gentleman, Albert's grandfather, was a white man, and they shared common ancestors, as did Dr. Blaise Douay in the middle here. Dr. Blaise Douay was the son of an formerly enslaved man who joined the United States colored troops during the Civil War. And he was also descended from a white Douay and an enslaved woman. Now, the remarkable thing about this is that here is my great grandmother living in the same community with this gentleman, Albert, and they both have relatives named Gaston Douay. My granny's father was Gaston Douay. He was a white man. Albert's and Blaise Douay's relative, Gaston Douay, was a black man by Louisiana law. Now, how can this be possible that these two people with the same name, same common ancestors and family are living here under vastly different circumstances based upon their racial designation? So that was kind of the impetus behind what I wanted to investigate. And this all comes down to Louisiana being very different from the rest of the United States. Here in Louisiana, we had what was called a tripartite racial system. If you're familiar with the work of Isabel Wilkerson and her book Caste, this is essentially what was going on here. It was a racial system based on caste. So Louisiana was a French and Spanish colony with roots in more of a Latin mindset. Think of the Caribbean. It was not an Anglo-British colony. Here we had the civil law. In the rest of the United States, they had the common law. Here, we were primarily Catholic. The rest of the United States were Protestant. There were a whole array of cultural and values that were different. And in Louisiana, from the very beginning, there were, once an enslaved population came in, there began to be a large population of free people of color. And because of that large population of free people of color, things looked very different here. So when I say tripartite, that means three. So we had this social hierarchy based on race. And the first was white Europeans. And then you had free people of color who were not enslaved, who had been freed. And then you had the enslaved population. When I talk about Creole, I am not referring to a racial designation. From the very beginning, Creole meant born in the colonies. So it meant anyone born here before the Louisiana Purchase and their children and grandchildren, whether enslaved or free, because they shared this early bond of being here from the very start and having the same religion and culture. And they spoke French, kind of a big deal, made it very different than the rest of the United States. So that is the basis of what we're going on here for Louisiana exceptionality. We didn't look the same as the rest of America. We still don't, but we really didn't back then. This is a picture that was taken as part of propaganda for the Civil War. It was taken by photographers involved with the United States and abolitionist organizations to try to raise money for freedmen here in Louisiana. And what they're emphasizing here, these children were enslaved. So these were enslaved children. Now, this disturbed people up north because these children didn't look like slaves. Because what was going on in the rest of the country was a binary system. You had black and you had white. White meant free, black meant enslaved. Here in Louisiana, it didn't mean that at all. We had the tripartite racial system, and we had a whole separate category that was colored as opposed to black. And it was a whole spectrum, okay, of heritage and African ancestry in a fractional sense. So they had racial designations like mulatto, which was half African, half European, or quadroon, a quarter African ancestry, and then 3/4 European. It's an octoroon, etc. This was just, I know that we hear that language now and we bristle and we're, it jars us and disturbs us, but at the time this was the way of life in Louisiana here. There were also laws here that made emancipation easier, and we had the wealthiest free Black community in the country. All right, so I do my history through personal stories. I believe that history is best told through the lens of people's stories, through highlighting personal lived experiences. That's the only way that we really are going to reach people in a way that we can't with just dates and abstract ideas and this anonymous grouping of people. So I came across a story of three or four women, and I knew that I needed to tell this particular story through the lens of these women. And first, we have Alice Thomason Grice. Alice was the daughter of a white steamboat captain and an enslaved woman of mixed race. He bought Alice's mother, lived with her as if she were his wife. This is in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, and had children with her. They lived in a kind of de facto freedom. He never actually emancipated them, and that's for a number of reasons, because of the legalities behind the system, the legal fees that would have um, been costly, and the fact that by 1857 the state of Louisiana had outlawed emancipation. So there were a number of factors as to why Alice's father didn't emancipate her and her siblings and her mother, but they lived as if they were free, and they lived as if they were white during the antebellum era. In fact, Captain Thomason moved his family up to Ohio for a time to live as free people, and eventually they returned to New Orleans, at which time Alice met another steamboat captain's son, a white man named Charles Grice. And Charles was the clerk of the Natchez, the famed steamboat, the Natchez. And they fell in love, and they lived as husband and wife and had children together. But during this time, which was the early to mid 1860s, they could not get married. It was illegal under Louisiana law. However, by 1868, after the Civil War, the state of Louisiana allowed for interracial marriage. Interracial marriage became legal, and so Alice and Charles were married and their children legitimized in the Catholic Church. Now, it was around this time that Alice and her husband chose to have Alice and their children begin to identify as white. They began to pass as white. And that was for a number of reasons, I think, in part because for Alice's children, they didn't even know their enslaved grandmother. They were rather removed from any of their heritage, but it was also because of the system of racial oppression that was in place in Louisiana at the time. I'm going to go into more of that later on. So, unfortunately and very sadly, Alice had about 10 children, and then she died of tuberculosis at a very young age. And shortly thereafter, a few years later, her husband, Charles, also died. And so these very young children were left alone without anyone in the world to provide for them and care for them. What would become of them? Well, they had a neighbor who was a trusted friend and whose life had been very similar to Alice's. She attended the same Catholic church that they did. She lived only a few blocks away from them. She also had a French Creole background, so this was someone that the family was very close to. And she took in the youngest Grice children and raised them as her own because she did not have any biological children that survived to adulthood that we know of. And her name was Marguerite Traig Grosinger. Now, Marguerite was born into slavery at Laura Plantation. She was the daughter of an enslaved woman of mixed race and the plantation overseer. And during the course of her time at Laura Plantation, she experienced sexual abuse and exploitation. Her primary role at Laura was to be someone who was sexually exploited by Flagy Duparc, who was the owner of the plantation, along with his brother and sister. And Marguerite was kept there for that purpose, held in slavery for that purpose, and was subject to great abuse. And we know this. We have documentation from a diary of a Union soldier who wrote about the circumstances of her life. During the Civil War, when the Union Army came upriver and was taking over the countryside and emancipating enslaved people on the plantations, Marguerite met a Union a colonel in the Union Army, and his name was Colonel Nathan Daniels. And he, along with a man named Major Francis Dumas, who was also in the regiment, helped her to leave the plantation. So she left the plantation with them and went to New Orleans to live. Unfortunately, Colonel Nathan Daniels turned out to be another man that exploited Marguerite, and that was not worthy of her trust. But she managed to get to New Orleans, where she became a keeper of furnished rooms, sort of like a boarding house keeper. And there she met a Hungarian immigrant named Charles Grosinger. And they married, and Marguerite chose to identify as white. She began to pass as white. She took in the Thomason children. She raised them as their own. In 1894, the Louisiana state legislature began the process of passing a law entitled the Anti-Miscegenation Law that would end interracial marriage here in Louisiana, which had been legal since 1868. Charles Grosinger and Marguerite Traig married at that time because they knew if they didn't, they would never be able to do so legally. There were two men who were witnesses at their wedding, Alexander Gall and William Forstall. And I followed the trail of these two men, and it led me to families very similar to that of Marguerite and Alice, women with similar stories. Georgina Gall and Marie Forstall, the wives of the men who were witnesses at Marguerite's wedding and who had lives very similar to Marguerite and Alice's, Georgina and Marie were their sisters, and they were the daughters of a free woman of color and a white man. They're also the granddaughters of a free woman of color who came here to Louisiana during the revolution in Saint Domingue, present day Haiti. She was a free woman, their grandmother, who had money and was educated, and she became a woman of property. She purchased this home on Dumaine Street, and this is where the family lived for several generations and where Georgina and Marie grew up. And the property was passed down over multiple generations. Georgina and Marie were educated, they owned property, they went to mass at St. Louis Cathedral nearby. They were very much a part of the Creole community. Georgina would grow up to marry a man named Alexander Gall. Like Charles Grosinger, he was a Hungarian immigrant, and he was a captain in the Union Army during the Civil War. Meanwhile, Marie, her sister, married a man named William Forstall. William Forstall was from a very elite Creole family. They noticeably did not marry until after his mother's death. All of these people, these women and their children, all passed as white, chose to identify as white, beginning in the 1880s, and in the 1880 census and into the 1890s. Now, why were they choosing to do this? Why were they making the very conscious choice to do things to hide their background, hide their heritage, and to make sure that their children would grow up as white in New Orleans? That is because of the horrific violence and brutal conditions here in Louisiana in the 1990s. This was a time of tremendous strife. This was a time when a war was being waged against Black people here in Louisiana. Lynchings became very common. Threats of violence were ever present. The last vestige of Black representation in the legislature was run out. They were run out of the parishes. There was tremendous election fraud. And so any kind of representation that Black people had in the legislature at the time went away. Then, after that, the Louisiana legislators revised the state constitution and stripped Black people, Black men, of their voting rights. So they could no longer vote through a variety of different measures. There was also, of course, the important court case Plessy versus Ferguson, which institutionalized segregation under law and had implications not only here in Louisiana, but nationally. And in fact, Homer Plessy, or Omer Plessy, as he would know himself as, because he was Creole, I discuss at more length in my book how his status as not just a Black man, but as a colored man, which was a very different idea in Louisiana at the time, impacted the lawsuit in which he was the main person involved. So if you're interested in that, I go into more detail about that in the book. There was sweeping legislation that transformed any progress that had been made during Reconstruction after the Civil War. In 1894, an anti-miscegenation law was passed. This outlawed interracial marriage. It was now forbidden for people of color and people of European ancestry, people who were considered white, from marrying. Then in 1908, people decided, the powers that be, the white supremacists that had now gained power in Louisiana, decided that it wasn't enough that Black and white people, or people of color and white people, not marry, they decided they couldn't even live together or cohabit because that was too dangerous. It threatened the purity of the white race. And so, as a result, in 1908, they passed this concubinage law, which forbid anyone of different races from living together. And then they could be prosecuted under the law. And they were. There are many cases of people being prosecuted under the law for living together and being of different race. So one set of these poor people who were victimized and gone after were the von Buelos. Edward von Buelo, and I may not be saying that right because I'm a Creole from New Orleans and not German, and he's German, so my apologies to German speakers. He was the first cousin of Prince von Buelo of the German Empire, and he was found guilty in 1909 of living in violation of the concubinage law. He and whom he considered his wife, Azilda Duvigneau, they were married in 1902 by a judge in Gretna, but under the concubinage law, they were now under arrest because number one, their marriage was not legal because they had married in 1902 after the anti-miscegenation law took place. And number two, they were cohabiting and they were considered of different races. Now, why is this? That's because Azilda, his wife, was the daughter of Adelard Duvigneau, a white man, the brother of a judge, and Marie Bechet, a Creole of color. Her parents' marriage, Azilda's parents' marriage, was considered legal because it occurred between 1868 and 1894, but Azilda's was not. So the district attorney charged this couple with violating the concubinage law and they sentenced them to jail. They were arrested. Friends and colleagues of von Buelo, who was the inspector of Internal Revenue for the U.S. Customs Service, bailed him out. And then he was just so overcome with everything that was going on and with what this would mean to his children and his wife and his marriage and the humiliation and the disgrace of it all and how they would come back from this because it was all over the newspapers and hugely sensationalized that he killed himself. He committed suicide. He was 49 years old, and he left behind a devoted wife, a 5-year-old daughter, and a 3-year-old son. The day after his body was found, the district attorney, who was named St. Clair Adams, told the Daily Picayune, the newspaper, quote, "The concubinage law is a good law. It should be strictly enforced. The only objection I have to it is that it does not go far enough." Now, in the meantime, we have a couple called the Treadways. The Treadways came from Plaquemine Parish, Octave and Josephine Treadway. And they moved from Plaquemine Parish because they were being pursued by the law over the Concubinage Act, and they moved to Orleans Parish. And would you believe that Octave's father went to law enforcement and alerted them of this and asked them to arrest his son and his daughter-in-law, whom he did not acknowledge. And so his own father had them brought before the courts. And during the trial, Lois Charbonnet, the Treadways' attorney, argued that Josephine Treadway was not a, quote, Negro, but an octoroon with only a slight strain of African blood. And so the judge ruled that the state must show the amount of Negro blood in the veins of the accused. And because she was not considered a Negro, she was a person of color in the eyes of Louisiana and under the law, the case was thrown out. But District Attorney St. Clair Adams appealed the decision to the Louisiana Supreme Court. They upheld the ruling because the concubinage law clearly stated concubinage between a person of the Caucasian or white race and a person of the Negro or black race was a felony. And she wasn't considered a Negro or black. She was considered a person of color based on the fractional amount of African ancestry that she possessed. So the DA then announced that the state legislature would be asked at its next session to amend the concubinage law so that the statute would be added to say anybody of color, any person of color, as opposed to just, quote, a Negro or black. And that did occur. And that the concubinage law was amended to include anyone who was at all of any ancestry that was not white. Now enter P. Henry Lanos. P. Henry Lanos was the recorder of vital records for New Orleans. He had held office since 1876. He had participated in the Battle of Liberty Place as a young teenage boy, helping the former Confederates take over and fight the United States government and in what was essentially a coup, and which brought about white supremacy, a return to white supremacy in New Orleans. P. Henry Lanos was intent on carrying out a crusade for white supremacy in the New Orleans Vital Records Department. This is Alma Forstall. Alma Forstall was the granddaughter of Marie Forstall from a few slides back, who was the free woman of color. She was the daughter of William Forstall, Marie's son. Now, William Forstall, remember, he's Marie Forstall's son. He's the nephew of Georgina Gall. He's friends with the Grossingers and the Thomasons. In 1913, he tried to get married. And he was denied a license by Lanos because P. Henry Lanos of the Vital Records Department said that he had a percentage of African ancestry and he could not marry a white woman. So William Forstall drove to Mississippi, where he was legally married to his wife and then came back to New Orleans. When the district attorney and Lanos found out that this had happened, they exposed Forstall, threatened legal action against him. They went to the press. It was all over the newspapers. And they outed him. And they humiliated him. And they went after his family. And his mother, Marie, threatened to sue the city. And she did. She sued the city, but the birth records and the birth certificates of her children were conclusive. They had colored written next to them. And so the case was thrown out. William Forstall had to go under the radar, leave his good job at D.H. Holmes' department store, and kind of almost go into seclusion. At the same time, there were other families being attacked, and at one point, for one case, they brought in records from St. Louis Cathedral and laid them before the court. Baptismal records that they claimed that had been altered by people. And it was debated whether or not these people were actually colored and were they in the white books or the colored books. This was an ongoing situation here in New Orleans. And to just give you an idea of what Lanos was like, he at one point said, "I have been in charge of these records since 1876, and it would be impossible for me to estimate how many such marriages I have prevented. The Board of Health records are the safeguards of the white race against mongralism. This question of preserving the purity of the white race is not an easy one, as many of our people seem to think. Individuals of Negro blood are continually trying to get by, and only the greatest watchfulness on the part of this office prevents their doing so. I have, during the past 37 years, collected genealogies of the families which have Negro blood in New Orleans, and I now only wait for the leisure to publish that record in book form." So Lanos has a book. And he oversaw 500,000 births, 375,000 deaths, 160,000 marriage licenses, and terrorized people of mixed race in New Orleans from 1876 to 1940. When his tenure ended, which only ended upon his death, a few years later, his successor was Naomi Drake. Naomi Drake was an autocrat. She took over Llanos's crusade and she followed it with a vengeance. She continued his policy of refusing to issue birth, marriage, and death certificates to people she suspected of being of mixed racial ancestry, unless they allowed her to issue them as colored or Negro. She even went through and altered records for people she suspected might be of African descent. She maintained a list of several hundred, quote, allegedly suspicious names, likely the same list kept by Llanos. These became flagged names, and when a record was pulled and discovered to contain a name on the list, it was set aside until Drake had personally cleared such applicants in terms of their family bloodlines or genealogies. So between 1960 and 1965 alone, as the result of Drake's policy, 4,700 applications for certified copies of birth certificates and at least 1,100 applications for death certificates were withheld. This created a backlog that posed serious issues for Orleans Parish, for residents who needed to enroll their children in public school or obtain life insurance upon the death of a family member. Attorneys were hindered in their work. They couldn't settle successions and probates, so much so that in 1958, the president of the New Orleans Bar Association amended the revised statutes to enable attorneys to obtain certified copies of death certificates themselves. Drake continued to obstruct their efforts, and the Board of Health became bombarded with complaints. So many complaints, so many angry attorneys and government officials that they dismissed Naomi Drake in 1965. But that wasn't the end of this kind of vendetta against people of mixed race in Louisiana. Race flagging would continue in New Orleans until 1978, when Dr. Doris Thompson put a stop to this practice. She made it known publicly after she was fired from her position as Department of Health and Human Resources that the Office of Vital Records had maintained a list of 250 names of white families with partially Black ancestry, as she called it, a list that was likely used by Drake and that could be traced back to Llanos. If you've got a good Louisiana French name, it's probably on the list, Dr. Thompson said. People were informed that if they wanted their birth certificates, they would have to agree to list their race as Negro or go to court to fight this designation. Now, you have to understand what that meant here in Louisiana at the time. It meant your children's educational aspirations would be limited. It meant your jobs would be limited, economic opportunities, the doors would slam in your face. You couldn't vote anymore. You were possibly threatened with racial violence like lynchings. There were very good reasons that people in Louisiana who could pass chose to pass at this time because it had a tremendous impact on their lives and on the futures of their children. Now, this continued until in 1970, a law enacted by the state legislature decreed that anyone who was more than 1/32 of African descent was considered Black. 1/32, and you were considered Black. This was the one-drop rule. The one-drop rule was in effect until 1983. 1983. That was a year after I was born. I'm getting up there, y'all, but I'm not ancient. In 1983, the Governor Dave Treen repealed this law. Oops, and I meant So this is the gentleman on the on one side of this is Colonel Daniels. Colonel Daniels helped Marguerite escape Laura Plantation, but on his other side is Major Francis Dumas. Now, Major Francis Dumas was a very influential and wealthy free man of color. He was the highest ranking Black officer in the Civil War. He was commended for his courage on the battlefield. He knew Marguerite. He was almost elected governor. He was shy by a few votes. Today, all his descendants identify as white because of the racial caste system in place in Louisiana and the white supremacist crusades of people like Llanos and Drake. And if you would like further details or to learn more, I go into depth in my book. Thank you so much for listening and for honoring these people and their stories.
All right. Thank you so much. You covered a lot.
I know.
Which I'm sure is only like a little bit of an introduction to everything that's in the book. You touched on some things that were really surprising and interesting to me. And I'm sure we've already got some audience questions kind of percolating and coming in through the chat. I'm going to read those first, but I just wanted to kind of recap a little bit. I always think it's interesting whenever we encounter a study that kind of questions the episodic way in which we learn history most of the time, and it's really interesting. I like that you highlighted just how nasty the things were in the 1890s. And it's interesting that, when we learn history, we learn about Reconstruction and the promise of Reconstruction and the Constitution that was passed then. And we learn about the end of Reconstruction and the Battle of Liberty Place. But then it's decades later that we have this movement for a total erasure. And it's, this big reactionary movement to push things back. In the 1890s, we end with the Robert Charles riot and
Yeah.
streetcar segregation in New Orleans. What was that, 1902? And this is where personally I was really surprised because in my own learning about the Robert Charles riot, I think Claire Adams is kind of a hero of that story because he attempts to prevent violence
Ah,
when the white mob starts, roving across town. And I was surprised to hear that he's such a proponent of this anti-miscegenation law and a real enforcer of it. I mean, which makes sense. He's the district attorney, but seems to have pursued it with gusto, which is interesting. So I wanted to I'm going to start going through the questions. So again, if I didn't say it enough, thank you so much. This is interesting.
thank
If I
you.
rush the recap, it's only because I'm excited to get to the questions.
Oh, and
Um,
just one thing I would like to add is one of the things I don't think, and I touch on it a lot in the book, but the reason all of this happened is because Louisiana shifted from the tripartite racial system to a binary system with the Americanization of Louisiana. That was a huge factor.
no, that makes sense. Um, so very first question. I really like how you defined the 1880 to 1925 as the age of passing. The first question is why end at 1925?
So that's not my cutoff. That's the overall scholarly approach. That's what scholars have decided. But I personally would say, it continued. It went on longer. And that's a great question, and I should probably look into more about why they chose to do that. Because you're right, people continued to make that choice. It was an ongoing situation.
Let's see here. Follow-up question. Um, so you mentioned vital records and church baptismal records. What role did the census play in this? And were there any instances that you came across of women using the census to change their categorization?
Well, that was the census was kind of the start, where you would find them sort of testing the waters, I think, because it was informal, more relaxed. And so all of the women I highlighted by 1880 were being listed as white in censuses. But in the census, you were what you reported yourself a lot of the time, unless there was someone else to contradict that, or unless there was visible evidence to contradict that, which goes into phenotype, which I do discuss too in the book. But in terms of the baptismal records and the births and marriages were what was primarily taken into account of, and I think that that was because Lanos had access to those records or could get access to those records, whereas census records, I think, were harder to obtain at that time. You couldn't just go on Ancestry like we can today, of course.
Yeah, and Lanos, somebody I knew nothing about. And then when he finally dies, it sounds like his replacement is even worse. Um,
And
another
I
question
did
from the
see
audience.
someone just say 1980, before 1980, you weren't what you chose. Okay,
Right.
I'm talking about this liminal group of people here. This is a smaller portion, so bear with me with that.
Oh, fair enough. Another question from the audience. So you mentioned uh, the 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 one family who attempted to kind of circumvent the system by getting married in Mississippi. Question from the audience is, what would have happened if somebody was married abroad?
That is a great question for a legal historian. I'm more of a social historian who has to learn about the law in order to tell the stories. I do mention someone related to Georgina and Marie, who one of their ancestors who did do that. He fell in love with or became attached to a free woman of color, and they actually moved to France to get married and live that way. But um, whether or not that union would be seen as legal in Louisiana at the time, I don't know, and it's very questionable.
So going back to Alice Thomason Grice, um, two questions. First off, crazy given the constraints, the social constraints, and the danger that they were under, to move to Ohio and then come back to
Yeah.
the largest slave market in the entire country. So the first question is, what do you know anything about their life in Ohio that you can share with us, and if it was any different? And then the follow-up question is that when we have this neighbor who takes them in, um, what neighborhood are we in?
Ah, so unfortunately, I don't know a lot about their lives in Ohio. I think it was for a decade or less. Ohio was the refuge of many people who were enslaved, who ran away, who once they crossed the river, they were free. And it was also a place where a lot of men who had relationships with enslaved women would sometimes send their children to be educated or to live as free. So I'm sure that life was probably less stressful for them there, but I presume economically for Captain Thomason, it might have been difficult for him. He didn't have the same connections as he did down here. And I think that their move back was economically driven. Now, the neighborhood that we're talking about when we talk about Marguerite and Alice was away from the French Quarter. Marguerite would have been known in the French Quarter. And so when she decided to reinvent herself, she moved up to what would have been kind of back of town at the time. It was Gasquet Street, now known as Cleveland Avenue. We're talking where the medical centers are. Marguerite's house, which was pictured on the slide about her, has been torn down. That neighborhood suffered dramatically when those medical centers were built. But this was a working class growing, burgeoning neighborhood at the time with St. Joseph Catholic Church as its center. So this would have been a better area for them to blend in and kind of reinvent themselves.
Another question from the audience. So you had read the Lanos quote
Mhm.
about compiling a book. What was a book compiled? Like what like this his to show off the work of his career?
So I have tried to find this elusive book. If it existed, it's not anywhere available now. It did exist. I have suspicions about. I wonder if it's lying somewhere in some not an archive in some government, like, because it was these were governmental records. These were held by our age, bureaucratic agencies, and I don't. I wonder sometimes if it's somewhere deep within the files or do you understand what I'm trying to say,
Mhm.
of our own government, of our own
Yeah.
government. it, if not, it's destroyed and or its whereabouts are unknown.
Um, so speaking of the time period, we know that there was a pretty sizable movement of people from New Orleans to Los Angeles around the turn of the 20th century and into the 1920s. And a lot
Yes.
of them because could be find it's like Black Creole people. And I was wondering if you came if it's included in your research, if there was anyone using this big westward movement. So, because I think if I recall, we have the example of like George Harriman, the cartoonist, who moved to Los Angeles and reinvented himself. And I was wondering if you covered that.
So I don't go into that. That's kind of beyond the scope of my book, but I will say that I know of many examples of that. I've also taken oral histories from people who talk about family members who did that. So that was not uncommon.
Um, I'm gonna pause. Forgive me if you put a question in and I missed it. I'm going back through to make sure I didn't miss any. I'm gonna go pause to make sure if anyone else has one. You can either type it in or raise your hand. Let's see here. We got someone from the audience saying that their grandparents made that move to Los Angeles. Um,
A lot of Creoles in LA.
well, I'm sure this is going to happen to me, and I'm sure it's going to happen to everyone else. That we're all going to come up with the questions right when it's too late. Those have that esprit d'escalier. Let's see here. Another question here. You brought up the image of the carte de visites that were made to show the fair-skinned enslaved
Right.
children. Um, does anyone know what happened to those children?
Um, Molly, um, Molly McNeil at UNO, I think, has done Molly Neal. I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank. I keep track of a lot of names, y'all. They're all in here. But I'm better with dead people names. But she has done tremendous. She's a professor at UNO, and she has done research on that and tried to track them down. I've dabbled in it a little bit. It's tricky because the children were brought up north, and from there, it's tough to know
Right,
what
and they're
happened.
adopted out, and then
That's right.
we lose the trail.
That's right.
Oh, here's kind of a logistical question. Is there going to be is the book going to be available through Audible?
There was a mention of that in the early stages. I haven't heard anything about that since, but you never know. Contact
Um,
LSU Press.
yeah, yeah. I was going to say, let's shoot an email to LSU Press, and let them know that you're looking for it. Let me check my own notes, make sure I'm not forgetting anything. This was very interesting. And I hope that everybody else in the audience found it as interesting and enjoyable as I did. This is a kind of topic that is it's difficult but it touches so many aspects of our society and our laws and our culture, which is what makes it so interesting. Um, so with that, I'm going to pause maybe for an awkward minute, see if anybody in the audience is holding on to any questions. And we got one. See, it's always good to pause. Where did Georgina and Marie Forstall and other mixed race children get their educations in pre-Civil War New Orleans?
Well, there was the LaFawn School. Now, I can't speak specifically for and there was also, of course, religious sisters and outreach from the nuns, but I can't speak specifically for Georgina and Marie, but they could read and write. They were literate, and it's interesting because they actually saw their economic status, go down after Reconstruction. Okay, they lost their property. All of a sudden, um, the churches that they used to attend were being segregated, and they were opening specifically Black only churches that they were supposed to attend. And then, well, Straight University was after the Civil War. See, someone wrote that, so that was after the Civil War. But as one of the other things that happened that I talk about is after the 1890s and into the early 20th century, educational opportunities for Black children were shrinking, and particularly higher educational opportunities.
Oh, that's very interesting. Thank you again for everyone who attended. Keep an eye out in your email inbox tomorrow for the recording of this. And a big thank you to our presenter and author this evening. Thank you so much for coming and talk to us. This is a very interesting topic. And a reminder to everyone, book comes out next month, LSU Press, or your favorite local bookstore. All right. Well, thanks again. And with that, we're going to sign off. Thanks for coming and have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.